In today's episode, we talk about what happens when highly successful aviators begin to doubt their own skill and success, living with that unsettled feeling that they'll be found out as neither competent nor capable.
It's estimated that up to 82% of professionals will at one point in their careers experience some level of what's called imposter syndrome.
We'll dive into how this can show up in your life, why we should care about this as a safety factor, and share practical tips for managing it to your advantage.
We'll also welcome special guest and Chairman Emeritus of the National Association of Flight Instructors, Bob Mader. He'll share his personal story of imposter syndrome and also give us lots of examples from the world of flight instruction.
The Calm Cockpit Podcast starts now.
On X12 Mike Oscar, runway 27, clear for takeoff.
Welcome, everyone, to today's episode. I'm Geeta Brown, midlife student pilot and licensed yoga and meditation educator with over 30 years of experience teaching high performers how to improve their lives without adding stress.
And I'm John Niehaus, corporate pilot and professional flight instructor. As we mentioned in the show opener, I'm excited to welcome a special guest to this episode, Bob Mader.
Here's how today's show is going to roll out. John and I are going to have a short little discussion and share an example of how imposter syndrome can show up so we can clarify it as a concept. And then we have a fantastic interview recorded for you with Bob Mader. And on the other side of that chat, we'll come back again and summarize the key takeaways so you can start to look at this in your own life, the life of your students, and start turning it into an advantage. So, imposter syndrome. You may know all about this already. It may be an unfamiliar concept, so I thought it would be worth taking just a few moments here to clarify what it is and also how to figure out if it's actually limiting you. So imposter syndrome was actually coined way back in 1978. Two researchers, Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Ament Imes, observed the experiences of about 150 women who had earned their PhDs and were respected professionals in their fields. However, they still felt a lack of self-worth, a feeling that they didn't belong, and that they had to continue to achieve academic excellence. Otherwise, they would be found out. The term quickly got coined, and they quickly did more research and discovered it's not limited to just women, that as John reported in the cold open there, something like 80% of professionals have at least one time in their career when they feel this way. And I think if we dug deeper, we'd find that most human beings have this feeling at some point. So what it kind of looks like, it's like this low-level hum of doubt or insecurity that you're going to be found out as not good enough. Something like, I'm not nearly as accomplished as the other people on the flight deck, or in my case as a student pilot, that person finished their certificate in 4 months. Why is it taking me so long? There must be something wrong with me. I must not be right for this. Or if you get a new job or a promotion, I just got lucky. That's why I got the job. We have a tendency to see what we don't have rather than what we know and what we have earned. So we tend to be looking again at what we don't have rather than what we know and earn. And it gives you that like low level anxiety. Quick example from my own life. I had already been through, high school for high performing musicians, my initial music degree, my master's in music, had been teaching for several years, had toured the world as a musician. I ended up teaching at a college because I hung a flyer near the college advertising my clarinet instructing. I was building a private studio. They reached out to me and said, hey, we need a clarinet instructor. Took the interview. Got the job. And then they said, we also want you to teach music theory, music history, and music appreciation. And in those first classes, I felt like a complete imposter because all I could see was that I had never taught college before. I couldn't see that I had been teaching on and off since 7th grade and had had a roster of private students for years, that my father was a professor, that I had 2 advanced degrees in my field. All I could see was that some of my students were older than me and that I was a newbie. So I way overcompensated. I'm sorry to those students. I was so hard on them. I was so strict. And I held such a high standard because I felt that like internal sense of like self-worth. I was really not very fun. So I don't know, John, if you've had moments in your career perhaps where you have felt like, you just got lucky or you're going to get found out.
Oh gosh, as a pilot, I feel it all the time. I mean, you'll hear it in the episode, but at sort of every level of achievement, it's like, whew, skated past that one. Hope nobody figures this out. And I mean, truthfully, I have what I consider a dream job, and I still wake up and go to work and am relieved every time my badge lets me in the door. So it's a good day when that happens. And, just to add to your explanation, I think it's also important to clarify that there is a difference between what we are talking about and the idea that we feel sometimes that we don't belong or we haven't earned it, and the idea of being humble. Because I think we all feel that too, where you can kind of go too far in the humble direction. But I think that those are two separate things.
Yes, absolutely. This is more about like an internal state of how you're self-talking to yourself, what's really driving your actions. And I think one of the key ways to how to assess if it's limiting you or not is that no matter what level of achievement you reach, you can have that dream job like John does, but your feeling internally does not change.
Right.
So that feeling of sort of constantly being unsettled or not good enough never goes away, no matter how many shiny accomplishments you have. So you can also assess if this is limiting you. If you have that, and I want to just say you because I've done it. I know I'm doing it if I have a constant criticism or judgment of other people, which sounds a little wacky. It sort of seems like, well, you're talking about other people at that point. But what it's for me, it's pointing at is that like inner state is I'm judging myself. I'm being overly critical of myself. So anyone who comes into my orbit, I do that same thing to them, judge and critical of them. You can be overly defensive of small errors. I had a student once who got one question wrong on an exam. And he proceeded to, for like 20 minutes, tell me about how wrong the question was. If they had just worded it differently, he would have gotten it right, ignoring the fact that he got like a 97 on that exam, and it really wasn't an important metric. Another way that you might sort of be able to assess if this imposter syndrome is creeping into your life, we often overwork way beyond what is needed. So we have that, again, that external success, yet we continue to drive to this mastery of this one thing, feeling like if we just become a master, then we'll be okay. But we limit ourselves to that one thing and never really push past the comfort zone because we are looking to that mastery to help us with our feeling of self-worth. So the danger, I think, of not addressing imposter syndrome is, again, that no matter what level of achievement you reach, your feelings don't change. So then that internal sense of like being less than starts to drive our actions. So I'm seeing an aviator maybe taking a risk to sort of prove themselves that they can handle it. Or we might overwork and miss the signs of burnout, and it comes to visit us during an emergency when we really need that clarity of mind. Or we can be training in these fears that we sort of have layered over because we actually haven't taken the time to look at it. So that's why I love this conversation that we have upcoming with Bob Mader, because he just gives so much insight as to how this can really be addressed, not only in primary training, but also once you've sort of quote unquote made it in the field.
Now, with that in mind, let's introduce our guest. Chairman Emeritus of the National Association of Flight Instructors and one of the most accomplished instructors that I know in the country, my friend, Bob Mader. Bob started flying back in 1995 and has accrued more than 7,000 hours, most of which involve flight instruction. He's a CFI, CFII, and MEI, and in addition to his time as a CFI, Bob's other life is recently retired from the Union Pacific Railroad after 40 plus years. His final role there was the Director of Unmanned Aerial Systems for a department that he helped establish. Bob will talk to us about how he has experienced and overcome the feeling of this dreaded imposter syndrome, and how he helps others as a CFI recognize it in themselves as they progress through their aviation journey. Bob, welcome to the Calm Cockpit Podcast.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
One of the things that is the catalyst to this episode is we were doing the More Right Rudder podcast. Again, if you haven't listened to it, you should. And Beth Stanton, NAFI editor, she does a occasional sort of episode takeover that she calls the Writers Behind the Stories. And she had you as a guest, and of course I listened to it, and I thought it was really good. And you know, you and I had touched on this subject very briefly, but never to the extent that you and Beth talked about it. And frankly, I don't know if that was necessarily a direction you guys thought you were going to go, but it happened so organic that it was very profound. And what I'm talking about is she was asking you about your writing skills and how when you took over as chair, you had to start writing position reports and you had to start writing for the magazine and for eMentor and even other organizations started asking you to sort of contribute to their publications. And you mentioned how you never quite knew, especially in the beginning, what your voice was. And you were sort of wondering why people were asking you, like, what do I have to say? Why am I a person you're coming to, you know, contribute to these things? And from the outside looking in, these organizations were going, because you truly do have a voice and you truly do have these things to contribute and your insights are important and profound, and sort of that disconnect between do I belong here and of course I belong here. And so I thought that was something really worth talking about on this podcast, because I think that the idea of sort of imposter syndrome is something that affects a significant portion of us, especially as pilots, and maybe we don't always talk about it. So, you know, can you maybe tell me a little bit about that conversation you had with Beth and sort of how that feeling is something that you've kind of discovered in yourself occasionally or however often that might be?
Okay, it's different than insecurity. I'll start there. I'm no psychologist. I don't claim to be one. So this is very layman oriented. Insecurity is where you're convinced you can't do something or you're never good enough, that kind of thing. And we've all had that feeling. Imposter syndrome is more of, you could be reasonably competent as a pilot or a doctor or a professional in a corporation or parent, whatever it is. And then people come to you and say, you're really good at this. And the objectivity goes out the window. And it's along the lines of, wait a minute, I just started flying. I don't have a type rating. Only been flying for 1,000 hours or 100 hours or whatever the number you want to pick. I'm hanging around with test pilots, people who I respect and admire. You may respect and admire. I won't talk about it for myself, but that you find yourself in these groups and they come to you and say, we really like what you have to say. Why don't you write about it? Wait a minute. You're so-and-so and you're asking me to write about something in your area of expertise. You're the pro. You should be writing this. And that's really what imposter syndrome starts with. It's, I am not worthy. How can I even respond to your request? That's one part of it. The other part is in Beth's, in the Right Rudder podcast with Beth, was in terms of writing. You get the feeling it's all been said. How many times can you talk about stalling an airplane? It's all been said, right? Thousands and thousands of pages. But as Beth points out, it's not said my way. It's not said the way you say it. And the whole purpose of that podcast was to encourage authors who might be nervous about writing to write. And it really comes down to, it's all been said. But in a broader context, it's, I really don't belong here. Not with this group, not with this company of people. The start of the conversation we're going to have here is, there's two traps you can fall into with it. One, you can go hide under a rock and never do anything with it or anything about it. Two, cope with it and grow, use it as a growing experience. And the other pitfall is that you can overcompensate and convince yourself that you're better than you really are. And losing the humility that is so important in staying safe. As they used to say in the old mythology days, don't fool the gods. They'll pay you back.
Well, so let's bring this back to sort of instructional experience.
Mhm.
Okay. I think for those of you out there that are CFIs, that to me is truly where some of that imposter syndrome really starts to kick in. At least it did for me. I mean, my first instructional job, I got hired with obviously no instructional time outside of having just earned my CFI certificate. And students don't know. It's like students walking in the door and needing a surgery, and the surgeon goes, "It's my first day. Let's see how this goes." They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that they're your first student. They don't want to hear that you have never actually done this before. You've flown an airplane, but you've never really done it this way. And I think the gravity of that sinks in with instructors. I think they sit there and they go, "I want to do my best." Hopefully that's what they say. And of course we want it to be safe. And I want to provide a quality product to this person who's trusting me with their financials, with their life, with their safety. And then you go, "What am I doing here? I'm not the right person for this. I don't know what I'm doing." When is the owner of the flight school going to wake up and say, "You don't belong here"? And of course, certainly experience does help with some of that. But, did you feel that as well? I mean, and how long did that persist as you sort of progressed through your CFI career?
What's the date today?
Yeah.
On a serious note, yeah, when I first started, came into the CFIing racket a little later in life than most people, with a lot of experience in a safety critical industry. I think any instructor who really cares about their students and realizes that the responsibility we have, we've promised the person in the airplane and everybody that surrounds them that we're going to bring them home safely every single time. That can weigh pretty heavily. It should be important. It should be the first thing that comes to mind. We have to make sure that everybody's safe. And again, you're a brand new instructor and you're sitting there with somebody in the left seat, and the first time you say your controls, you don't know what's going to happen. I think initially for a brand new CFI, they've been to an examiner. They have to realize they've been through an examiner and inspector who has seen a lot. We all tend to forget that the initial CFI is probably the hardest ticket to get. But being vetted by somebody who's seen, as I said, seen a lot, getting past that individual is a tough task. They want to know that you can teach this stuff. And that's really where I would recommend the starting point for the new CFI is. You've gotten past somebody. There's a reason that oral exam is so long.
I think that in aviation, we also have another aspect to it. And again, I can really only speak for myself, but there's not just the gravity of the situation at hand, whether it be safety or otherwise. It's that dream aspect. And maybe, there are other professions out there that can understand this. I think doctors probably understand it as much as we do. And it's something you think about for years before you achieve it. It's something that you truly have to want to do. And so the idea of it potentially slipping through your fingers at any given moment is not just the loss of a job. It's the loss of an entire lifestyle. It's a loss of a personality. It's a loss of something that you have worked years and years and years for. And it's something that can carry with you. So like in my case, every time I go get a new airplane, in the back of my head, it's like, okay, here's the first one I'm going to fail. I'm going to lose this job and I'm never going to get another job. I'm going to go and start the first flight in this airplane. And finally that boss that I have is going to look over and go, "Why are you here?" And that then, sets in force the dominoes of every bit falling down. And, I'm not saying that I think about that all the time, but I would be lying if under certain amounts of stress that those thoughts didn't sort of creep in. And so, from a pilot standpoint, we so desperately want to be there because we love it and we're having fun, that the idea of somebody going, "You don't belong here," almost kind of seeps in more prolifically than it might in other careers.
I would agree with that. This is a relatively small community. Everybody knows everybody. As I tell young CFIs, don't make somebody mad, because it's going to come back at you. You don't have to agree with people, but don't throw rocks. You're 2 handshakes. Whoever you threw a rock at is probably 2 handshakes away from somebody you really want to be friends with. Okay, that's a real good possibility. Getting back to the imposter syndrome, yeah, it's a very peer-oriented business, which is why it requires humility, I think. And sometimes we go too far. We go to the from the right stuff, the over aw shucks thing that Tom Wolfe talked about in the right stuff. Pilots sometimes are outrageously humble when we talk amongst ourselves. Yeah, well, I kind of just sort of found the airport, But the thing is that we want to earn and keep the respect of the people that we're around. It's funny. This came up in my own mind the other day. A young student who just got his private, his family went out and bought a 182 in celebration of his getting the private certificate. I've been coaching him in the airplane. He needs the time for the high performance sign off, and I've been working with him. He's a pretty good stick, but he was rushing things a little bit. And I said, do you mind if I take it around the patch one time? I want to show you how I fly a 182. And once we got about 3 feet in the air, it came to my mind that I sat there and said, I haven't landed a 182 myself in about 5 months. Everybody else has been flying the 182, and all I've been doing is coaching, because I'm getting high-time pilots and I'm walking them through how to fly a 182, right? So I'm bringing it around and I'm showing a brand new private pilot who got a certificate just before Christmas. Okay, here's how we're going to land your airplane. And in the back of my mind, I said, I better not smack this thing down. And I better not tag the nose gear and all the other things, all the other horrible things you think about. And the landing went fine and all that. But it's always there. It's always lurking. To your point, John, it's something that if you're at all conscientious about this business, it's there. I'm only as good as the next mistake that I make.
I think that holds true to all of us.
Yeah.
I love that you are so open and honest about this, Bob, because this is really one of the primary drivers to the podcast, is normalizing these kinds of conversations. And what I hear you saying, because you have this career arc where you've sort of seen every level of pilot, that from a student pilot like myself at midlife to a student pilot in high school, all the way on up through however many hundreds, thousands of hours you have, that these thoughts are completely normal. They're part of the game, and it's partly human nature, number one, and then partly because of the environment that we work in. So I love that we're just sort of normalizing it, because I think one of the secondary effects that can happen is we have these thoughts of imposter syndrome, like, don't mess it up, the student is watching. And if we follow that rabbit hole without acknowledging that it's normal, that can actually lead us to making the very mistake that we're afraid of making, because we start to perseverate on it. So do you have a magic tip or trick for when we see these thoughts come in, and especially when you're flying? How do you redirect your mind?
It really comes up at the private level, just before their practical test.
Well, I'm asking for a friend because, I'm in the solo cross country phase. So help me, Bob, help me.
Okay. Well, first of all, for instructors to help their students through this, the first thing I tell them, look, my skin's in the game too. I point out to them that the first 3 words of every endorsement, properly written endorsement anyway, start out with I certify that. And I certify that is not just a legal requirement. Okay. Yes, if I certify somebody that is patently not ready to do whatever they're going to do, I could probably get nailed under the federal perjury laws, although I'd be probably pretty hard to prove. On a more moral basis, I certify that says I have told the student, I have told the FAA, I have told the insurance companies, I have told my personal deity, and I've told myself, the person I have to look at in the mirror every single day, that this person is ready for the task that they're going to do. Whether it's I certify that they can solo, I certify that you're planning, in your case, the planning is safe for your solo cross country, that I reviewed the flight plan and that you are up to the task, and that if you get lost, you'll get unlost on your own, because I ain't there. I'm not there. I won't get vernacular on you. But that's the way I say it. You heard me say it exactly the way I say it to a student who's concerned about it, all the way up to the student pilot who's terrified of seeing the examiner. I say, look, I signed you off. You're the one who's going to pass. I'm the one who fails. If you crater in front of the examiner, it's probably my fault because I didn't prepare you well for this ride. Whether it's the physical challenge of flying, the physical stick and rudder challenge of flying the airplane, whether it's the knowledge portion, or I will take it one step further, the emotional portion. I had a student who, due to family pressures, fell apart in front of the examiner. It's going to be an article someday, but the short version is that there was a mistake made by a prior instructor, and the kid lost 2 hours of his solo time. Something in the book wasn't signed properly. That time just went away. As far as the FAA is concerned, it doesn't exist. Improper sign-off. And the kid had a meltdown right then and there because he thought he couldn't take the test that day, and he was under incredible pressure from his parents to get done. And he had enough time. I would never take a kid to a check ride that didn't have the requirements. I'd audited my own numbers, and they were all sufficient. But he thought he didn't have the required solo time, and so he cratered, and then he couldn't answer a single question correctly to the examiner. The examiner had no choice. I'm not faulting the examiner at all. And I'm not faulting the young man. I'm not even faulting his parents for putting the pressure on him. I'm faulting myself for not managing that pressure, helping him manage that pressure, not recognizing it. And it was a learning lesson for me. And this happened less than a year ago. And so he's gone on to be a great pilot. He got through his check ride, and it was a learning experience for him. But that's the negative way of describing it. What you have to do, we instructors have to coach everybody to say, look, if I've said you can do it, you can do this. Now, that means we have to take our responsibilities. We just can't take somebody kind of glance, in your case, Gita, your cross country, we can't just glance at your flight plan and say, nice straight line between whatever the points are. Good luck. We have to know that they're thoroughly trained and they have proper checkpoints and all that other stuff, and question the student, drill them. So there's a yin and yang to it. We have to own it, but then once they have to hear their own answers, you have to coach them in such a way that they hear their own answers. Yeah, I can handle this. What are you going to do if you get lost? What are you going to do with this? What are you going to do with that? What are your alternates in an emergency? And give them the confidence that they can do it, while reminding them that, I hate to tell you this, but it's only a 50-mile trip, and a goose can do it without thinking about it. So be humble while you're doing it. You're not Marco Polo here. You're just learning how to figure out where you're going. So you have to balance those two things. You can't let them get this gigantic ego that they can do anything, so they don't wind up flying into a disaster. But at the same time, saying, look, yeah, you can handle it. And most honest people will say, are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Just go. You're fine. And again, as I tell everybody, I'd rather be behind a student pilot pushing them instead of in front of them saying, what makes you think this is a good idea? I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does, very much so. Thank you.
I want to expand upon that because I want to coax something else out of you, Bob. So let's take Gita's question, and let's understand that imposter syndrome has many tendrils, right? So it's not always just I'm a pilot and I don't believe that I'm good enough or any of that stuff. I think that there's as with anything, there's varying degrees of gray. And some people, as a student pilot, let's say, might just be sitting there going, I can't do this, right? So let's take stalls. It's a very common thing that student pilots are afraid of, okay? And we all know that we, as a CFI, we train the maneuver, we explain the maneuver, we demonstrate the maneuver, but at some point, that student has to do it. And at some point, that student has to do it by themselves, right? And I think we've all had that one student, or maybe more, where they go, I can't do this. I can't do this. And you have to sit there and you have to say, A, I know you can because I've seen you do it, but you have to somehow convince them, in a level of that imposter complex, that they are good enough to do this maneuver, that they're not going to hurt themselves. And of course, you did mention that, they have to trust you, and that's part of it. But as a CFI, how do you help them get over sort of that complex of, I can't do this, I'm afraid?
In an extreme case that I had recently, I had somebody who's terrified of stalls, and he literally wound up crying on my shoulder on the ramp. Never touch your students, right? I wound up hugging this guy because he was bawling on the ramp after the lesson. And I just said, I know what to do. And he goes, what? You're going to go see a friend of mine at another airport. He owns a decathlon. No, Citabria. Sorry, Citabria. And he teaches people aerobatics. And you're going to go through spin lessons. I'm afraid to do that. I said, I know you're afraid to do that. But I can't spin a Warrior. It's not it's placarded against that. You're going to go see so-and-so, and he's going to take up, and he's going to spin you, and I'll give him the background on this so he knows you're nervous. And to his credit, he could have said no. He could have quit. He could have fired me right then and there. To his credit, he went up to the other airport, went out with a guy. And from the story I heard, he was shaking and nervous when they walked into the airport. He was terrified when he got the parachute put on him. But he got in the airplane, and he flew. And after the third spin, he said, can we do some more? When he found out the wing wasn't going to come off, that nothing horrible was going to happen to the airplane and all that other stuff. And he came back with a much different attitude, and we broke that barrier. So you have to find the things that work. Now, is that imposter syndrome on his part? Yeah, because the student looked at me and said, you're not afraid of these. I'll never not be afraid of these. I'm not good at, and he actually said, I'm not good enough. I said, yeah, you are. If I didn't think you'd ever be good enough, you wouldn't be flying. I'd tell you to go take up golf. Find some other expensive hobby.
And that's what I wanted to pull out of you, because, you told me that story a couple weeks ago, and I think it goes back to the CFI toolkit of always not just listening to your students, but figuring out different ways to do the same thing, whether it be, to your point in writing an article, a different way to say the same thing, because you may have said it 5 times, but it's the 6th time that it clicks. And so when a student comes to you and says, but Bob, I know we've done it before, and I know that you've been there, and I know that you've been pretending not to pay attention, but I feel safe with you. Now I have to go up and do it by myself, and I'm scared. That is absolutely a variation on that imposter complex. And it's to the CFI to get creative and figure out not just identifying that this is an issue, but also taking it seriously and finding different ways to allow that student to progress through it, because you're not just going to say, oh, you'll be fine, and make that feeling go away.
You're not. And let me add to the story. One of the things I forgot to tell you is the reason he broke down and cried on the ramp, where he had such a catharsis, is when I looked at him and said, are you afraid to tell me you're afraid? And that's when he broke down. And he said, yes. And I said, I don't care. Fear I can deal with. That's easy. Okay, we can coach you. We can help you with this. But if you don't tell me you're afraid, I can't help you. I don't know what's going on. I'm not a mind reader. I'm empathetic. I try to be empathetic, but I'm certainly not a mind reader. So but the real trick is finding out what the core of the problem is. And I'll bring it back to me personally. For me, writing. Let's go to the writing thing that Beth and I talked about. I've been reading articles by people I consider to be real pros at the business for years. Rod Machado, Brian and Barry Schiff, you name them, all the pantheon out there. People who could, who I respect and think can really write well. And then I'm being asked to write in the same magazines. And I was afraid of making a fool of myself. And I finally had to say that out loud to myself. I'm really afraid of saying I'm going to say something stupid here, and realizing, you know what? So I do. The worst happens, the editor sends it back. The second worst thing that happens is I get a bunch of letters. Nobody's going to take my certificate away. Nobody's going to beat me over the head. In terms of flying, again, as an instructor, when I worry about, well, I'm going to name names this time. I'm keeping names out of it. Craig O'Mara, a good friend of ours, John.
Mm-hmm.
I was supposed to, just as background for everybody, he 747 check airman for United, retired as a 787 check airman. He flew the Sophia for NASA. He actually carries 2 ATP certificates in his pocket because of all the type ratings. They don't fit. He's been around a long time, flies everything. He's a Part 61 instructor. He flies for the Commemorative Air Force, is qualified in their entire fleet except for the B-29, I think. Anyway, it gives you an idea what kind of pilot he is, and a lot of respect. Well, the first time I met him, I was supposed to check him out in a Diamond DA-40 G1000. It was the first time he'd ever flown one, and I was supposed to check him out. And I was sitting there with all of 800 hours. And here comes it, and I'd heard about this guy, and he gets in the right seat of the DA-40. We go, I know your background. I know there's not a whole lot I can show you. It's just going to be a checkout and this, that, the other thing. I was completely intimidated by his experience. And he said, stop. This is your turf. I don't know anything about a DA-40. I don't know anything about G1000. If you think we have Sirius XM radio in the cockpit of a 747, I got news for you. This is completely different than what we have. Take me up and show me how to fly this airplane. That's your job. Probably the single best lesson I ever got.
I mean, and that is sort of the perfect answer to one of the questions that I was going to have with the idea that trying to teach your fellow pilots out of feeling that way. I think that Craig is a great example of a humble pilot who can recognize when, somebody's got stars in their eyes as he walks by. So, yeah. Because I felt the same way when I met Craig, and he is just one of those CFIs that's always willing to share every bit of knowledge that he has, but put you at ease while he's doing it. And, that's a hard skill to have. Now, I do want to take a step back a little bit, because something that you had said earlier in the interview was the idea of maybe going too far, in the sense of, okay, let's try to help this person feel confident. And then you cross that threshold into overconfidence or arrogance, right? And I think that there's the old joke that people like to say about pilots, and that's, how do you know there's a pilot at the party? Well, they'll tell you. Something that I actually am very conscious of, to a point where sometimes I tell people I'm an accountant. So, there's two sides of this question. The first side is that how do we make sure that when we are telling somebody that they're good enough, that we don't cross that threshold into unearned confidence? But then at the same time, in an industry where we tend to be labeled as arrogant, do you find that arrogance can also be a mask for compensating for the fact that you're not confident in your skills maybe as much as you should be?
Wow, that is one of the more profound questions I've heard along these lines. And it kind of goes back to, I forget which Supreme Court justice said it. I don't know how to define it, but I know obscenity when I see it. You can tell the difference when you meet pilots, whether they're not confident enough or their lack of confidence doesn't match their skills. They're better than they think they are. That they're at about the right level of confident cautiousness. And then there's the arrogance bred by either overcompensating or just not being aware of how dangerous they are. And we've all met them. We all know it. And how do we do that? I think part of it is when we talk to our clients, our students, our learners, whatever word you want to use this week, we have to impress upon them that, first of all, flying is relatively safe if you respect it and do it right. But it is very unforgiving of disrespect. Flying will eat you alive if you don't respect the environment that you're in. And you have to impress that upon people. You have to do it in such a way that they don't become afraid of what they're doing. They have to understand that if you stay within your personal and the aircraft's envelopes, the two envelopes, it's going to be pretty hard to screw up. But you have to teach them where the edges of those two envelopes are, and they're not always in sync. It's a moving target. proficiency versus currency and all those other things, along with the capability of the aircraft. So you have to make them aware of that. The trick is when you coach somebody out of being nervous or afraid or having imposter syndrome, and then you coach them out of it, you have to watch out and make sure that they don't bite off more than they can chew. And I think if you have a client that is in that position, as a CFI, if we have a client that's in that position, part of the conversation, or part of what our obligation is, I firmly believe, is helping them recognize that they're getting into, in a safe way, that they're getting into trouble. So the little lessons that we can impart about how being over the top, being Icarus. Was it Icarus that melted the wings?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can't remember if Icarus was the son or the dad. But having too much confidence in yourself and your abilities can lead you into melting your wings. And that's how you build a balancing act. We instructors have a greater role, in my opinion, than just saying, here's how you push, pull, turn, bank, and here are the regulations. Helping them expand their envelope and move the limits as they go along. If you look at the endorsement, the 90-day endorsements I hand out, the wind speeds go up as I hand out those 90 days for a particular student. Hopefully it's only 1 or 2 90 days, but I've had a couple of cases where, okay, we got to keep going here. And the wind limits grow. Mm-hmm. Because I've exposed, and they've shown me they can handle the airplane. And sometimes they're surprised by the number I write down. So, yeah, I've seen you do it. Go fly.
And that's why I think that, you're such a good guest to speak on this topic, because to your point, CFIs do play such a big role in what type of pilot, from a personality standpoint, individuals become. I mean, certainly somebody's going to be who they are regardless, but the amount of sort of positive influence that you can have on them will change the way that they operate once they have earned their certificate and sort of seen you in the rearview mirror. And what I'm hearing you say, purely comes down to honesty. And I to bring this to maybe the non-aviation folks, the hardest question in a relationship, no matter who you are, does this outfit look good, right? Do I look good in this?
Yeah.
I don't care if you're a man, a woman, or anything else. Do I look good in this? And you stand there and you go, oh God, what do I do? Because do I be honest and say no? Or do I say, of course you look good, knowing that they're going to go out in public and look ridiculous? So, you do the same thing with the student. You have to be honest with them, even if you know that there's going to be maybe a slight negative consequence, because if you are so dishonest with them that you say, no, you're going to be great, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, they're going to fall on their face and go completely the direction you don't want them to go.
Yeah.
And so we as CFIs tend to want to be that motivational coach, the person who's there to cheerlead and build them up. But if you do that too much, then all of a sudden, back to that whole point of unearned confidence, now you've created a monster.
Part, it's the honesty thing. Every flight, there's something good that comes out of it. But at the same time, you have to look at a student and say, yeah, you just scared the heck out of me. That was not a good way to do that. But again, getting back to the whole managing the confidence, that you have to be able to be brutally honest without breaking their spirit.
Do you think that everyone is susceptible to feeling that imposter syndrome? Do you think about the students you've taught, or are there some people who seem to have it in greater measure than others, or is it just something like we all have?
I think most people with a fair amount of emotional intelligence have it to varying degrees, and I think it's situational. There are some people, I think most good pilots will have this because they're always trying to be better at what they do. just like this is a performance art, just like music. I'm not a musician, but it's just like music. There's a great organist from Anna Lapwood from England. Look her up. She's fun her posts are fun to read on Facebook. And she always talks about how lucky she feels to be playing the great organ in the Albert Hall. And the point I guess I'm making is that in any performance art, that if you don't think you can improve, you've got a problem. So most good pilots are always aware that they can do better.
Love it. I think that's going to be very reassuring for a lot of people to hear that it's normal to feel this way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to be honest for a second. Geeta, you are stuck in a room with two flight instructors who could talk all day. So if I'm truly being honest with us, I think that this is a great place for us to sort of wrap things up a little bit. Bob, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I hope that maybe we can find an excuse to bring you on again.
I really appreciate it. I appreciate the time. It's always a lot of fun to do these. And I'm always a little nervous about them because I don't know. I don't know if I'm good enough to do these podcasts. So thank you very much. Anyway, I appreciate it, and I've had a lot of fun, and I appreciate you letting me blather here.
That chat and interview with Bob was packed with lots of really thoughtful and insightful commentary. I had a few Post-it notes out to take what I thought was going to be a few notes, and I ended up with there's 9 of them there full of information on the front and the back. But one of my key takeaways from him is that he's not only personally self-aware, but because he models this kind of open and honest conversation with students and colleagues. And I found it so refreshing, and it must be amazing to have a mentor like that. And John, I know he was your boss for a really long time.
Yeah, it really was a privilege to work with him and for him for essentially 14 years. I learned so much about things like this just by watching him do his thing and sort of understanding in some cases that he was unsettled, but sort of pushing through it himself. And so that has definitely helped me in my leadership capacity, just watching him do all of what he does. So it's humbling to see all the effort he puts into just overcoming it.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. So at the end of the interview, I said, Bob, let me take a run at summarizing your key takeaways. And he agreed that I, for the most part, had them down well. So I really wanted to share them with listeners here, sort of like that, too long didn't read part that you see at the end of long blog posts, but also just to sort of summarize it in bullets so that for listeners, as this sort of resonates with you, that there can be starting maybe an emerging framework in your own mind of ways that you might address this either in your students or in yourself, or just as a way to start exploring some of your own growth edges. So here's my running shot at the wrap up of bullets from Bob's interview. And the first one was really more of a mindset, less of a take away and go use this. But I think mindset is so important. To me, it's like that true north on the compass. If you keep a mindset, then no matter what external situations change, you can always return to that internal mindset. So the big one that I got from him is that imposter syndrome is completely normal and all human beings have it, which it can sound sort of trite, but I think that it can start to feel like it's something that you have to solve or something you have to get rid of, or it means something about you if you have these feelings, rather than it's just something common to every human being. And as such, that kind of inherently makes it no big deal. In aviation, it can get really highlighted and rise to the surface because it's a high demand, can be high stressed, and it's an unforgiving environment. So it may get exacerbated in that situation. However, it's normal and it's okay if you've got it. It's learning how to manage it. That's really the key there. So moving on from that sort of overall mindset of there's nothing wrong with you, I think that another key takeaway is that we can use these feelings of imposter syndrome to enhance our own safety, only though if we start to have a little bit of a system in place to address it. Otherwise, it can lead to overcompensate And then that leads to overconfidence that he was talking about that can be very damaging. Or we can be so insecure that we don't speak up and do the things that we need to do in a timely fashion. Figure out what the core of the problem is. This is easier said than done because very often it'll kick out lots of other things you have to filter through. However, if there's a core limiting belief you have about yourself, about your ability, and if slowly over time you can peel back the layers and drill down to that, you have a running shot at overcoming it and working at it systematically. Another takeaway about how to figure out this core problem then would be to give yourself and other people permission to acknowledge these feelings. Very often we pretend like we don't have it. We avoid it. We certainly don't want to talk about it. And, you don't have to talk about it to your coworkers over morning coffee during the pre-flight briefing. But if you can find key people that you feel comfortable talking to, that can help you to start to drill down a little bit as to what's actually going on. Because sometimes it's only in conversation and reflection back and forth that you can peel away the layers of what you think is going on to what's really the underlying limiting beliefs. Once you start to get that little sense then of what these core limiting beliefs are, another takeaway I heard Bob said was to take baby steps to challenge the imposter syndrome. Take it to the point of where you're slightly uncomfortable and then push that envelope a little bit. You don't have to do it all at once. Last takeaway from Bob, although there were many, but these are the key ones. In the meantime, while we're drilling down to these core limiting beliefs, we can trust and borrow other people's confidence in us. Initially, we all trust that CFI who signs off on our first solo, even if we've acted as PIC ourselves and said, yes, I'm ready for the solo, send me in, put me in the game, coach. We're still borrowing their confidence that we can do it. And I've found it to be a really nice way to reality test what I'm thinking about myself, because sometimes we get so skewed in our perception of ourselves that we need someone who knows us well and who has our best interest at heart to reflect back to us what they see. It's really hard to see ourselves. So if you don't have a mentor or two or three, find one. My own takeaway is that acceptance, self-respect, reassurance, self-acceptance, these are all core needs that all human beings have, regardless of your level of accomplishment or responsibility. Acceptance, respect, reassurance, they're non-negotiable, and they're huge drivers of our sense of stability. And when they're unmet, they can lead to so much mental stress, which can lead to behavior patterns that aren't helpful. So this is all to say, I think personally, this work matters and is important. Our minds will throw up to us when we start to look at this. That doesn't matter. Just go work on the checklist. That doesn't really matter. That's silly. Focus on your procedures. I'm here to tell you this work really does matter and it's important and will lead you to be not only a safer aviator, but also a more relaxed, helpful, useful human being for other people. So this work matters and it is important. How'd I do, John?
I think you did great. And I think it's a great place for us to close out this episode. And if you're listening to this, obviously you have found us already. But wherever it is that you listen to these podcasts, we'd love it if you could subscribe or set automatic downloads in whatever way it works for the platform that you have. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Calm Cockpit Podcast. You can find us on our website at calmcockpit.com. And we're also on YouTube. So we're trying to kind of hit you in every different angle that we can. So with that in mind, fly smarter
and stress less.
Traffic holding across the runway 33 left, 3 left.